to this Pathways to Planning seminar, where today we're going to be focusing on national significant infrastructure projects. I think many of you hopefully know me by now, so I'm Kat Salter. I work as part of the Planning Advisory Service, and I'm seconded 1 day a week to support colleagues in the LGA on the Pathways to Planning programme, leading very much on the learning and development. So we have a series of slides, which I'm just going to share with you. Let's see how the text's going. And so hopefully you can all see, yeah, excellent, thanks Gareth. So as I said today, we're going to be focusing on NSIPs. This is the agenda for the morning. So welcome and introduction. So as I said, I've introduced myself. So I'm going to also say hi to Gareth Brough, who's my colleague at PAS, and also Lou McLaughlin from Arab. And my colleague Lorraine is here as well, who's going to be helping with the tech. So if you want to say hi, Lorraine. Great. So the session we have this morning, in a second, I'm going to hand over to Gareth and he's going to talk to us about the sort of nuts and bolts of NSIP. So what are they? How do they differ from some of the work that you may have been doing already within planning, because it is a different regime. We're then going to hear from experiences on the ground from our colleague Lou at Arab. And then, as we have in previous sessions, have a chat with you about what the Planning Advisory Service do within this role. So how do we work with local planning authorities to support them on NSIP projects? Lots of time and opportunities for question and discussion, so please do pop any questions or queries you have either within the chat on Teams or using Slido. So hopefully you've all got either your phones with you or means of getting onto the internet, because I'd really like to find out who we have in the room here. So as with all these sessions, just a few introductory questions, just so I can get a sense of what programme you're studying. My usual one, what's the weather like? I'm intrigued to know if it's as cold where you are as it is up here near Bradford. And also just to get a baseline understanding and knowledge of if any of you are working on NSIPs. So that should be open for you now. So if you can just spend a minute answering our introductory questions, I'll stop sharing and then we can see who we have here with us today. How's it looking, Lorraine? Have we got people
coming
away?
Through? The first question is, which pathways planning cohort are you in? We've got 67% for cohort 3, really close for cohort 1, and then following for cohort 2.
So cohort 3, you're starting in September, so you're all relatively new to planning. So this will hopefully give you a good introduction to a part of planning, as I said, that you may not be involved in so far. Degree programme, majority of you are on the masters rather than the degree apprenticeship. And then I think this is always my favourite question, the weather. I am, it seems to be a British thing, doesn't it? If we don't know what to talk about, we talk about the weather. Freezing, yes, I agree with those of you who are cold today. Cold and grey, we have got sunshine in some places. A bit rainy in Manchester, it looks like. But yeah, soggy, cold, freezing, maybe not the nicest day out there, but hopefully you're all tucked up in the warmth. NSIP. So have you got an NSIP in your area? So the majority of you actually don't know. So maybe that's something to take away and have a chat with colleagues within the planning team to see if it is an area of work that you are involved in. I think Gareth's got a map where he can show us where I might have made that up. Yes, he has. I think he's got a map where he's going to show us where the projects are. So maybe
very high level though, Kat. But
okay.
But there is a geography that we can talk about. Definitely, yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah.
And then are you involved in NSIPs in your role? Nobody is. Okay, so maybe those who are involved in NSIPs have decided that they are learning on the job rather than coming to this session. So that's really, really useful. Thank you very much for taking part in that. As I said, it's really nice to know who we have with us today. So let me just go back to the presentation. So I'm going to hand you over to Gareth now. That's okay.
Yeah, lovely. Thank you, Kat, and thanks for inviting us along, and really good to meet everyone. So yeah, I work with Kat. I'm a principal consultant in PAS, and one of the pieces of work I do is I work on NSIPs, Nationally Significant Infrastructure projects, and we run a network of local authority practitioners like yourselves who are working on NSIP schemes, which I'll tell you about a little bit later on. And if we move on a little bit, Kat, I'll kind of what I want to do is just go through what they are. I'll be honest, I hadn't until I started working in this area about 18 months ago, I knew literally didn't know what an NSIP was because I've been quite insulated from them in my part of the world where I've been working. But they are very different. So we'll look at some of the ways that they're different as well. And being planners, well, we have to talk about the process, don't we, a little bit, and how we consent them and what the key stages are, because that's where you and us will be working at certain stages on NSIPs potentially. And I'd particularly like to talk about as well as, people coming into the planning profession, what this might mean for you as a planner. Lou's going to talk about the exciting stuff of what it's like on the ground, but I genuinely think this is a really exciting area to be working in, and it's an area that more of us are going to need to be working in soon rather than fewer, given the scale of ambitions in it as well. So hopefully you'll find it as exciting as we do. But it was interesting to hear that, about 2/3 of us here today are kind of coming into are on the third cohort, so coming into planning for the first time. And I do feel for you because planning, like all professions, has its own acronyms and jargon, and NSIPs has its own acronyms and jargon within that as well, and some of the most exotic, strange 3-letter, 4-letter acronyms that you're likely to come across. So it does sound very alien. Even if you're used to planning, there are things that I learn an acronym every time. So bear with me, and I have a bit of a jargon buster, and it's the usual stuff. People use acronyms just to try and save time and stop using long terms, and that's all it is. Nothing to each. It does make sense when you understand what they are. But before we get on, just one key point um is kind of why we have NSIPs, and I've put a picture of an airport there just to remind me that NSIPs are actually quite new. They were in, if you like, created under legislation in 2008, and the idea for this new type of planning, this new form of planning project, was really developed in the wake of what was a very long-running kind of saga around Heathrow Terminal 5, where that was consented and developed through a more traditional planning route, and it just essentially took so long, particularly through a planning inquiry, that the government of the day realised that there need to be a better way of making planning decisions and planning for the big infrastructure that we needed as a country, and to make a process that was fairer and faster, not just for the applicants, but also the communities that host this infrastructure as well. And that's what NSIPs are all about. So if we move on, in terms of, if we just really simply define what an NSIP is, so in short terms, they are the big infrastructure projects that we are trying to build in this country. There are kind of two important words there: big and infrastructure. In terms of infrastructure, what we talk about are 5 potentially different types of infrastructure. So we've got, as it says there, energy, transport, water, wastewater, and waste. So energy covers anything like a solar farm or a wind farm, or well, it will cover a wind farm soon, but also things like pylons and energy transmissions lines that carry energy, interconnectors where energy from the Europe lands on our shores, and nuclear power stations. All those things are potentially relevant to NSIPs as well. So transport, airports, some of the bigger roads and railways. Water, that's really growing. You'll have seen on the news the water shortage issues that we have in some parts of Eastern England, and we are seeing new reservoir plans being pulled together now. But it's not just reservoirs, it's things like pipelines and things like that that carry water as well. Wastewater, so that's wastewater treatment works, sewage systems, etc., and waste, hazardous waste facilities. So there's not one definition of infrastructure. There are potentially 5 different types of infrastructure that fall into the NSIP regime. And when we talk about big, we talk about nationally significant, and the way that this is defined under the legislation is it's basically around thresholds. So at the moment, it's anything that generates over 50 megawatts of energy onshore, like a solar farm, is an NSIP. Anything in terms of electrical lines that is greater than 132 kilovolts or over 2 kilometers long is an NSIP. Basically, it's thresholds. The bigger, the more relevant it is to NSIPs. And I've highlighted something there because this is quite a dynamic system, and the government have currently got in line proposals for changing some of these definitions. So this threshold of 50 is rising to 100 megawatts under the Planning and Infrastructure Bill, so that will change. So basically, there is a legal definition there, and you'll see that I'll be honest, this is a little bit dry. So I asked ChatGPT if it could develop me a nice symbol that I could make my life look more, my slide look more attractive with. And it came out with that. I think that's meant to be the Houses of Parliament and Big Ben, and a planning act saying that, and then a gavel to show that this is the message is it's a legal thing. We talk about an NSIP being made rather than consented. So when an NSIP is actually given consent, it's formally made like any other piece of legislation, and it's as powerful as any other act of parliament that is passed in parliament. It's very potentially powerful piece of planning legislation. So in terms of the next slide, NSIPs can be consented. They do have to obviously receive consent, but rather than a local planning authority making that consent, it's a relevant Secretary of State that decides. So if it's an energy NSIP, it's decided by the Secretary of State for energy, Secretary of State for transport if it's a big road, or environment if it's a reservoir, wastewater treatment works, etc., etc. So it is very different from the local planning regime that you guys are working in. In terms of how it's examined and how it's managed, it's the Planning Inspectorate, or PINS, that's another acronym that we call it, who manage the process and are the authority that examine an application. And our local authority role, so where we work in local authorities, rather than being a decision maker, we are really statutory consultees, so we comment on it and help shape and inform it, but we don't make the decision on NSIPs. So basically, consenting an NSIP, it's very centrally driven and driven by the developer, and the local authority are a consultee, and we call that consent a development consent order, or DCO, and essentially, as it says there, it's a single combined consent for the whole infrastructure that can bring together lots of different powers that would normally sit across multiple regimes. So if we move on to the next slide, Kat, you can see that one DCO, it can give planning permission or planning consent, but it can also give the developer powers to compulsory purchase land and property. It can also give the developer, highways and street works permission. It can give them listed building consent, so it can include changes to a listed building. It can give them permission to lop or fell trees. It can even give them permission to enter private land to measure or monitor. So as I said earlier, it's a very powerful legal measure, and it's kind of, whereas if we did normal planning, you'd have to get planning permission and then seek compulsory purchase order and then approach the highway authority to get permission to work in a street, or apply for a separate listed building consent. It's all wrapped up in one big development consent order, and sometimes people call it a super permission. A couple of things are still separate that it's probably worth noting here, that some things like environmental permits and marine licenses can't be wrapped in a DCO, but the vast majority of things can. So if you look at that lovely shot of a solar farm, it's permission to to build and construct all those arrays of solar cells across the field. It's also gives you permission to access the land. It also gives you all the planning permission you need to set up highways and access to it from the highway and roads, etc. It gives you permission for any plant or other things you've got to build. So it's kind of, it's not just the principal development, but it's all the things that happen, that need to happen around it to make it happen at the same time as well. Okay, so we're looking at the next slide. I'm sorry, the map is very small, but I was struggling to try and keep this short, and we could talk about where NSIPs are in a lot of detail, but essentially I think they're about, since the legislation passed, there's something like 260, 270 NSIPs in the country. The great majority of these have been consented, so they've got permission, construction's underway. That doesn't mean to say work's been finished, but the vast majority of underway, but we are seeing more at different stages of the process there. And all that map does, it shows you where they are. We won't go into detail because you won't be able to see your local authority boundary, but I do think there's an interesting geography around this. So there's a lot of the NSIPs that you see there are down the east coast of the country. So the ones out in the North Sea, they're offshore wind farms that require consent, and you can see that because of that offshore wind sector and the energy coming from the continent, we've had a lot of NSIPs on the east coast of the country, and there's a real geography to this. And I notice we might have some people here today from Suffolk. Places like Suffolk and Essex have got some great experience because they've had to deal with a lot of energy related NSIPs, whether that's on offshore wind farms coming to land in their part of the world, or whether it's as I said, an interconnector, which is a point at which a great big cable from the continent lands on our shores, if you like, to distribute electricity. A lot of it is happening down the eastern side of the country. In terms of the policy framework for making those decisions, though, I think that's what this slide just tries to cover really quickly. So we have what are called national policy statements, or NPS, and these set out the national need for the infrastructure and the basic policy criteria around how applications will be assessed and how impacts need to be mitigated and judged. And there are different types of NPS. So for different types of infrastructure, you can see there are about 12 or 13 different NPS, half a dozen for energy and different forms of energy, 3 for different forms of transport, and then 4 around water and wastewater. We've had a history in this country of them not being very up to date, but the current government seems to be very much sorting that out. So it's updating all the NPS that we have, and it's also bringing in legislation to ensure that future governments keep them up to date and refresh them at least every 2 years. And that's really important because where an NPS is up to date, it basically sets the need for that infrastructure and removes the right to question the need for an NSIP. So again, really, it's a little bit more black and white than some of the other issues that we have when we look at local planning balance. So if we move on a little bit, Kat, we have to have a bit of a slide around process, because it is an interesting process and it is a different process. And I'm sure Lou will kind of bring this to life with examples and case studies. But this is, if you like, the ideal situation. So the DCO process follows, to consent, at least half a dozen stages. There's a big emphasis on the pre-application stage. And at the moment, there is a duty on an applicant to consult on proposals and kind of really raise the awareness of a scheme even before it's submitted. But essentially a lot of work, we like to call it front loading. A lot of thinking goes into the early part of the process. But once that's done, that application is then moved on, and it's, as I said, it's submitted to the Planning Inspectorate, or PINs, who decide whether to accept it. There's a whole range of documents that we can talk about there. The draft development consent order itself, but there's also a planning statement, explanatory memorandums, etc., that the developer's responsible for sharing with PINs as part of that. And PINs, require them to notify local authorities who are hosting it, but also neighbouring authorities. So essentially, once PINs have accepted it, then we move on to a pre-examination stage, and we have what's called an examining authority, which is made up of 2 or 3 planning inspectors, and that's where local authorities and other stakeholders get involved in being registered as an interested party, making representations, etc., etc. There's lots of, there is a preliminary meeting, but the kind of examination itself, when we come to that, is very much a paper-based exercise. So things are done through written representations where people put forward views in writing. Local authorities have the opportunity to do that, but also prepare things like local impact reports that the examining authority has a duty to consider. So the local authorities will look at what the impact is of a particular scheme on their area, and kind of hope that that's considered by the inspectors when they come to their decision. There's a statement of common ground that will be prepared, showing where the developer or applicant kind of has common ground and agrees with the local authority and other stakeholders, so that the examination can very much focus on problem areas. I'm whipping through this a little bit, but kind of ideally the examination should only be 6 months long, and the examining authority make a recommendation and a report, which is then passed on to the Secretary of State, who has a time target of 3 months to consider that and make a decision to consent it or refuse it after that 3 months has elapsed. We have found in the past that Secretary of State can take a lot longer than that, but as I say, the current government is really keen to see this process kind of speeded up. Overall, this process should take about 2.5 years, but we have found in recent years that it's moving more to like 4.5 years, and this is an issue that the government are trying to address. But so you can see that process is quite different from the local planning process. And if we move on, Kat, I think it's worthwhile just summarising some of the differences. Really, that's all. I guess we share these slides, don't we, Kat? So hopefully, yeah, this is more for reference, really. And what I've tried to do here is just show how the 2 different planning systems, our local planning system, which we're more familiar with, is slightly different to the National Infrastructure Planning System. So it says there, there's different legislation. That's a key reference point. But then there are different responsibilities for managing the process. In local planning, it is the local planners themselves and the local planning authority that will receive an application and will process it and will consider it. For NSIPs and national planning, it's PINs. The decision maker is different. Obviously, it's not the local councillors or planning officers under delegated authority. As I said, it's the Secretary of State. There's a different planning context around national policy statements rather than local plan. And as we've just said, the process is slightly different as well. Different kind of vocabulary, different timescales, different roles for different actors, different steps that have to be met. But when it comes to it, it's a parallel, and there are lots of similarities. And what we're finding is, working with local authorities, that a lot of the skills that we have as local planners are really important in the NSIP process as well. And local authorities are really central to making this work well. And maybe we want to discuss that under questions and answers as well, is around, what the local authority role can really do under an NSIP. Again, just before we move on, Kat, I've highlighted a little bit there as well. As I say, at the moment, pre-application consultation is statutory, and applicants or developers must consult on that, but the government are looking at removing that statutory pre-application to try and speed up the process as well, and that is throwing up quite a lot of issues that we might want to talk about later. But if we move on, I just wanted to think, it's been a real whirlwind tour of what an NSIP is and how it works and what the process is. But, some key messages there around big infrastructure and the importance of infrastructure to us as planners and to the government. And I think just looking ahead and why this agenda is really important for us as planners is, particularly underlined by the current government. We have got a mission-led government. The government aims to double onshore wind, treble solar energy, and quadruple offshore wind in order to meet its clean energy targets. Some really significant targets there. And we hear a lot about the 1.5 million target for building homes. What we don't hear a lot about is the government's target to fast track 150 NSIP decisions, which again, a really big challenging target given the rate of decision making we've had on NSIPs in recent years. They're also looking to broaden the NSIP regime as well, the government. So, essentially, the NSIP regime can be faster and more certain than the local planning regime, and priorities like data centres, gigafactories and laboratories, the government are looking at they are amending legislation so that some of these big new digital infrastructure that we need for our economy can be brought into the NSIP regime rather than decided locally. They're also bringing onshore wind back into the NSIP regime. The previous governments had taken that out. As I said earlier, they're raising the threshold, so it will be only the bigger schemes that come through the NSIP regime. And alongside that as well, we are seeing a much more planned approach to particularly energy system planning. And we won't go into this now, but you might hear things like terms like strategic spatial energy plans or regional energy strategic plans. And the government are looking to try and, believe it or not, we never had one single plan for the energy network across the country and how that needed to grow and develop to meet the country's energy demands in different parts of our country. We are now looking at having one of those in place through the current government, and regional plans as well to look at what that means for each region of the country. So I just wanted to emphasize that a little bit before I finish, Kat, and talk about really just how important this area of work is for us as planners. If we'd see the news, you'll see that we might not see the term NSIPs a lot, but these projects are making big headlines in the news because, they're controversial. The Great Grid Upgrade is National Grid's project to invest £30 billion in basically cables and pylons and substations to make those new sources of energy generation, like offshore wind and solar, connect to where the energy is needed, to our towns and cities. And clearly building, several kilometres of pylons through open countryside is controversial. I live up in South Yorkshire, so I see the Yorkshire Green transmission, pylons taking shape north of York and out towards Knaresborough. They're really, you can't miss them. Is it about 170 kilometre line of pylons being built between Norwich and the east of the country and Tilbury around the Thames, really big schemes that go through some sensitive areas. And it is, very, very controversial, but a really exciting area to be working in as well. Another area, Kat, if we just move on, so I'm aware I've gone over time a bit, but another area of work I wanted to flag was solar farms. We see a lot about solar farms in the news at the moment, and that's not surprising given the government's target to quadruple solar, to treble solar, which is pretty significant. So just a few facts, but basically the roadmap that the government set out will want to kind of see us generating 45 to 47 gigawatts of solar that should be 2030, and our current capacity is 18. So you can see we've got to double what we're doing at the moment, an additional 27 to 30, double what we're doing to be able to meet that target. And you will hear people say that we should have solar cells on all the roofs of all the buildings and factories and warehouses, which is maybe a good idea, but current government analysis suggests that that might deliver up to 10 gigawatts. We've still got to find space to accommodate 65% of our need, and a lot of that will mean ground-mounted solar, probably in agricultural areas that are currently greenfields, clearly controversial as well. In terms of how that gets consented, about 3/4 will come through local planning, through the Town and Country Planning Act, 25% through NSIPs. That's what the government are estimating. So wherever we are likely to see something like a solar scheme come into our team to be able to work on, which again, really interesting, lots of opportunities, but lots of challenges as well. So that's the nuts and bolts. I guess we'll pass over to Lou now, Kat, for kind of a little bit more what it means in practice.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Gareth. And I'm conscious we've got a couple of questions in the chat, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to save them until after Lou's spoken. So please do put any questions you have in the chat and then we can pick those up as we go through. But great questions so far. So yeah, please do either use the chat, or if any of you are still logged onto Slido, you can pop them in Slido as well. But thank you, Gareth, for that overview. Really interesting. And I am particularly, I didn't know that about solar. I think that's amazing that we've got that kind of target and how the landscape is going to change, I guess, as we go forward with the ground-mounted large solar schemes, with our move towards I guess net zero and trying to tackle climate change as well. So really interesting to hear that as well. So I will stop rambling and pass you over to Lou, who's going to talk about her experiences on working on NSIPs in a range of different industries and locations. So thank you, Lou.
Thanks, Gareth. Thanks, Kat, and thank you all for having me. So lovely to meet you all. My favourite, before I move on, my favourite solar thing is I'm probably responsible for half of the new solar coming forward. So apologies if none of you like solar. But even with all of the solar, to kind of reach the targets, it would still require less land take than all of the existing golf courses in the UK. So that's my favourite kind of anti-solar come back when I get people shouting at me at consultation events. But enough about solar. If you skip to the next slide, please, Kat. So just a quick intro to me, really. So before qualifying as a planner about 4 or 5 years ago, I did a prior career in strategic comms and public affairs. So also still relatively new to planning itself. And kind of a different background and going through a different route. So probably quite similar to a lot of you on the call. In those kind of 4 years, I've got experience in English, Welsh and international consenting routes. So I know the focus today is obviously on English and NSIPs, but there are quite a few similarities across the Welsh planning system. I know there's a couple of people from Welsh local planning authorities on the call, and international consents as well. I specialise in major infrastructure, but have experience in strategy, policy and DM. And in the 4 years, I've kind of worked on over 20 NSIPs in a varying capacity. So some of those are kind of communications. So things like your consultation report, statutory notices, etc. And then also kind of acting as planning lead and expert witness, and across a range of sectors as well. So primarily energy, transport and water. If you skip to the next slide. So as I mentioned, my background's in comms and public affairs prior to becoming a planner. So the question I got asked quite a lot when I joined Arup is, why did you leave comms to come to planning? Surely it's a wholly different career. And actually, I think there's a heck of a lot of transferable skills from kind of being a planner from various backgrounds. So I didn't actually see it as that much of a jump. It's just more about, like Gareth alluded to, the 5 million acronyms that grow every day, also change every day with the changes to legislation, which was the challenging part. But I think there's kind of the communication, so just talking to people, having a chat. I think relationships is one of the key successes of making an NSIP work, even if you've got opposition, even if you've got a challenge with the developer or kind of as the local authority. I think if you've got those good relationships and that good communication skills, it actually solves quite a lot of the issues and makes life a little bit easier and more enjoyable for everyone. You've got collaboration, project and people management, adaptability and flexibility. So Gareth helpfully presented the kind of structured timeframes and statutory timeframes. I think, yes, whilst they are in place, the planning inspectorate more so than anyone likes to kind of throw curveballs at you, and you have to adapt and kind of be flexible quite often. But I think all of this presents opportunities, so hopefully I'm not scaring you away from NSIPs. There's problem solving, kind of time management, again looping back to those statutory time frames, interpersonal skills, and also critical thinking and analytical skills. So a lot of it is data review and report writing, which I know sounds incredibly boring. I promise it is interesting, but you have to kind of get into the nitty gritty and get to know the details. And I think you kind of get out of NSIPs what you put into them, as cringy as that sounds. So they're kind of you can have the opportunity to be really, really involved, and kind of take a lead on it, or you can kind of sit on the sidelines and do bits and bobs. They're quite easy to drop in and out of, but they're also really interesting if you want to get into the nitty-gritty detail. So on the next slide, as I kind of alluded to, I've got experience working with local planning authorities and working on behalf of them. So I'm just going to touch on a kind of example or two of each of those, and then at the end I've got some helpful links that might help for some further reading if you're interested and we haven't scared you off. So working with local planning authorities, this is a non-exhaustive list of the stages that LPA should get involved during the NSIP process, but they're the kind of ones that I've got most experience on, so feel most comfortable talking to, but don't take this as gospel. So there's other things on there such as secondary consents, which Gareth mentioned, that you can wrap some things up within a DCO so that it becomes kind of a one-stop shop for all of your consents, but there are some things which Gareth also really helpfully mentioned that you can't, and some of those are down to the local authority to consent or grant permission for, but often these kind of timescales run in parallel with the wider project programmes. I think it's really important to acknowledge those. You've got things like scoping opinion, so we're talking about the extent of the environmental assessments and supporting strategies. So I know we'll come on to questions, one of them talked about the economic benefits, so often kind of a socio-economic impact assessment will be included within an application, and that looks at things like impact to tourism. It can look at things like job creation, not only during construction but operation, and if relevant decommissioning, kind of construction workforce, etc. The scoping kind of also looks at supporting strategies and reports that are going to be provided. So projects are kind of more often than not looking to de-scope, and sometimes that can be seen as a negative thing, i.e. thinking that, developers don't want to spend the money, they're too lazy, they know that there's risk associated with it. But actually, proportionality is one of the cornerstones of making NSIPs successful, which is probably ironic when you see the size of the applications and the tens of thousands of pages. But more often than not, they are kind of incredibly proportionate in comparison. And again, not wanting to scare you all, and maybe it's the previous comms person in me looking for the positives, but whilst it can seem quite overwhelming, it also does present a lot of opportunity. So whilst there can be, especially at scoping stage, limited information from applicants or developers or promoters to inform advice and positions, I think actually looking at it as an opportunity for local planning authorities to shape a set of standard principles which you kind of want to see as part of major infrastructure moving forward. That doesn't mean necessarily that you'll be able to influence, obviously, your local plan, which forms part of the policy assessment, but there's things like design guides and kind of supporting guidance that can be used, and also applicants have to have regard to that. I think also Gareth helpfully mentioned that the Planning Act 2008 came about as a direct result of Heathrow, which took about 20 years from planning to kind of consent. Largely that's as a result of the politics and the role that politics played. So the purpose of the Planning Act was to kind of remove, or at least heavily reduce, the role and influence that politics has on planning, which as part of your kind of existing or future roles, you'll probably come to laugh at the next thing we're about to say. But part of the job is to manage the political appetite and expectations, especially where decision making is largely removed from local planning authorities for NSIPs. I think that's part of the challenge when I'm acting as a developer working with local planning authorities is supporting them to have that balance between what is the planning need and the planning requirement versus what is the political appetite, which I think is a really interesting and again a really good opportunity. But I think there are definitely challenges with that, which I'm sure you will all come to face at some point. So on the next slide, I've just got an example of a project where working with developers and local planning authorities really closely has worked really, really well. So some of you will probably be familiar with this or have heard of it. So the A417 missing link it is, or was, a single carriageway or dual carriageway, which is now in construction, actually. It's a landscape-led, collaboratively evolved design. We've been able to do that as a result of kind of the stakeholder engagement work and working with local planning authorities. So we created a strategic stakeholder panel, which was led by the local planning authorities. I think helpfully, we had 3 host authorities, which kind of helped with the resource constraints. And because of the work that we did at early stages and kind of the involvement that we were able to have, we received over 70% support for the preferred route. So obviously at kind of early design stages, there was multiple options. And actually from working with the local authorities and the politicians, we started off with a history of 20 plus years of someone saying kind of what was the Highways Agency to then Highways England to then now National Highways saying that they would do something about it. As you can probably understand, 20 years of saying you're going to do something and nothing ever happening gets quite frustrating. So actually politically, it was a bit of a hot potato. No one really wanted to touch it with the barge pole and everyone was quite angry. But we actually kind of, by the time we got consent, we had public statements of support from the politicians and local authorities as well, which was no mean feat. But actually, I think a lot of that was a result of the direct work that the local planning officers did to support us and kind of understanding the need and managing that for us. So I think whilst decision making is kind of taken out of your hands, actually the role that you play as part of NSIPs is incredibly important. And just a little nod that as a result, we kind of won some collaboration awards jointly with the local authorities at some kind of planning awards as well, which is really good. And then working on behalf of, so the kind of the other side of the coin, again, these key stages of involvement are a non-exhaustive list. The ones in red are just those that were kind of different to what was presented earlier. Again, they're just ones that I can speak from experience having involvement in. So discharge of requirements. So requirements are akin to planning conditions, which you get on a Town and Country Planning Act or kind of smaller applications. But for DCOs, it's a really important stage for local planning authorities because it's where decision-making abilities come back to you guys. So for me, this is why engagement at the pre-application stage is so incredibly important, because it's incredibly difficult and complex to try and unpin what Gareth referred to as a made DCO when you've not had any involvement in it previously. So understand obviously that teams change and kind of resource requirements change, etc. So you might get put in a position where you haven't had the opportunity to be involved at early stages. I think where you can, it's incredibly helpful to kind of stay on a project if you want to from beginning to end. It's also quite nice to be able to go out on site and see something that you've worked on for kind of 5 years start to be constructed as well. So maybe that's just the infrastructure nerd in me, but it is quite exciting. I'm kind of currently working on behalf of North Wales Shared Planning Service. And as part of that role, I'm supporting local planning authorities in North Wales during the examination and implementation stages of various major projects. And having had no involvement in the projects up until this date, it's really, really challenging to kind of read through the documents. Despite what I said earlier about proportionality, they are still incredibly long and complex assessments and years of history to get to the point where kind of applicants submit something. So there is just a lot of information to read through. But it is quite challenging to kind of understand what's been proposed, why those positions have reached the kind of scale of effects and mitigation, and ultimately kind of what the job is to see whether or not the plan and balance is that it's balanced, and that kind of acting as the local authority, we can feel comfortable with what the developer and the contractors are planning on delivering. So I think that's the working on behalf of local planning authorities. My experience is that's the challenge, is having the same resource dedicated throughout and kind of limited technical officer support as well. So I think as planning officers, we often get the response being, well, we don't have an ecologist, or we don't have a landscape officer, or we don't have an ARBS consultant. So tell us what you think from a planning perspective, and suddenly you're the county ecologist, which again seems quite daunting, but again, it's a really good opportunity to expand your horizons. And it goes back to that transferable skills about kind of niche backgrounds, comms, and just that strategy role. So on the flip side of where it does work well and where it doesn't work well, one of the projects in North Wales, Sgurwen onshore wind farm. This is one of the ones that I'm acting on behalf of the local authorities of. The North Wales Shared Planning Service, basically no authority in North Wales has any particular resource, so they all kind of divide and conquer amongst them, which can work incredibly well and can also not work so great. And part of the challenge is that just because there is so much development, and I mean Suffolk and Norfolk will be all too familiar with this, because there's so much development coming forward, there's just not the resource available, which is kind of why me and some of my team have been asked to support. But because of the lack of involvement in the pre-application stage, it's kind of examination was due to start this month / start of next, but actually the application itself has been suspended before examination truly kicks off, pending further information from the applicant, because of the amount of issues that are now being raised now that the local authority has some more support. So again, I think that if I know the challenge is resource, I think my advice would be to try and front load it as much as possible and spend as much time as you possibly can in the early stages, because it makes your life and everyone else's life a lot easier further down the line. And actually then your involvement moving forward doesn't have to be quite so intense and can be a bit easier, and can be easier to hand over to other people as well. But I think it's just an ongoing resource issue, but hopefully you guys will be well placed to try and bridge that gap. And then, the last slide, I think these will be circulated afterwards, is just some helpful links to have a read through, probably if you're struggling to sleep at night for some of them, because they are very long and very complex. But there's just some helpful links there. I think the reference guide to NSIPs is actually a Suffolk Council publication, which is really, really helpful. They've kind of gone through the process hundreds of times and know it inside out. So the officers and the team there are incredibly well versed in it. And actually, I think it's a good kind of one-stop source of truth from a local planning authority perspective. Obviously, the other links are helpful, but they are more from central government or PINs or legal teams, where they're kind of one step removed from the day-to-day working as a local planning authority officer. So yeah, I hope that was helpful. But if you've got any questions, then pop them in the chat. I've just popped my details there, so if you've got any questions afterwards, then feel free to get in touch.
That was great. Thank you very much. And really interesting to hear the various hats you've worn and the various job roles and interactions with NSIPs. So thank you for that. And I think I mentioned when we last spoke that I actually saw the works underway on the A417 when I was visiting my sister in Cheltenham a couple of weeks ago. So really great to see that coming forward, because I know as a resident of Cheltenham how problematic that junction could be. And what you were saying about I didn't realise it was 20 years, but I was living in Cheltenham for 5 years, and the whole time I was there, the discussion was about that junction and how to speed up traffic flow and make it safer for everybody moving along that route. So thank you so much for that, Lou. I'm actually going to pass back to Gareth just for a couple of slides, just explaining the role of PAS. So as I mentioned at the beginning, the role of PAS is to provide high quality advice, support and training to local planning authorities. And one of the work streams that we support, well, Gareth supports, is local planning authorities on NSIPs. So if I can just pass to you for a second, Gareth, just to explain what work you do and sources of information for those on the call as well.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I mean, it has been a quick overview, but I think it's really helpful to hear from Lou just what it means in practice. And there is such a lot more we can learn from what's happening in the country. So I think some of Lou's sources as well just going to be really helpful. I would commend the work that they're doing in Suffolk. They've got a centre of excellence there for NSIPs, and their guides are aimed at people like yourself to pick up and read. They're quite wordy, aren't they, Lou? But they're kind of like, you really do get the detail there if you need it. In terms of what we do, we try and complement that. So yeah, we do have some resources, and when you share the slides, that'll take you to the web link. We have some NSIPs web pages where we do kind of signpost and direct people to online information, and we provide some sessions, recordings of sessions a little bit like this, doing introductions. Got some really interesting presentations there around things like community benefits, some of the benefits that local authorities are trying to bring for their local communities from NSIPs, and we look at kind of what it means in practice in particular local authorities across the country. So I would direct you to those. We also manage a network. So really this is very much a network of officers who are working on an NSIP from their local authority. We got some really good people on there from, you know, Suffolk and Essex and Norfolk, people who have done this many times before, but we've also got people on there from, I don't know, places like St Helens or places in Leicestershire that are maybe only doing an NSIP for the first time. And there's such a lot of kind of contrast between experienced local planning authorities and local planning authorities where this is completely new. And what we're trying to do is really kind of develop the sector's knowledge overall by identifying best practice and sharing that with more and more local authorities. And we do work directly with some local councils as well. We do training and reviews of the service that they do. But importantly, and this is something we haven't talked about, but I can see there are some questions about this, you know, from Ryan in the chat, that, you know, the government are introducing legislation to change the system following the Banner review, which was a review of, you know, the NSIPs and what's slowing them down in essence. And, you know, I think what PAS can do quite well is link up national government to local government and get them talking in the same place. So we're really pleased that we have people from MHCLG, DESNES and different government departments to come and talk to us about the reforms, and so that we can understand them and kind of make sure that they're going to work in local authorities when they come live, as well also ideally inform them as well and give a local authority perspective on what can really help on this agenda. So if you just move on, I mean, yeah, if you need it, that's a reference point. That's some of my favourite acronyms. I bet you could add to these as well, Lou. But, you know, there were, you know, it is a language, and I would recommend trying to understand it really. But it's kind of, you know, you can learn a few acronyms and very quickly become an expert on NSIPs if your local authority is getting up to speed. And I do think there's a lot of opportunity for planners to really kind of really make some really interesting kind of career choices around working on NSIPs. So I hope that we can encourage more people to do that.
That's great. Thank you very much. It's been really great to hear from you both, and we've got a few questions that are coming through on the Teams chat, which we can go through now. For those of you, if you do prefer to use Slido, I'm just going to leave that slide up just for another second in case you want to put any questions through the Slido Q&A as well, and then I'll stop sharing so we can see the panel in well, bigger, I guess, rather than the little thumbnails. So I think the first question I'm going to link to is actually just where you finished there, Gareth. So Ryan asked specifically about the Banner review, which you've explained, but do you think do you get a sense of whether we've turned the corner on the NSIP process in terms of kind of speeding things up and reducing delays in the process, or are we not there and is further reform needed?
That's a really good question, Ryan. I'd be interesting to kind of get your view on it as well. But I suppose what I would say, it does feel more serious, and this is maybe not of kind of, I don't want to sound political, but it does feel like this government is far more serious about delivery on NSIPs, and I think things have changed. So the Banner review made a number of recommendations, some of which the government are already getting on with, like updating national policy statements. If your MPS is out of date, it does make it a lot riskier and you are more open to legal challenge. If you've got an up-to-date MPS, you're in a better position to be able to make decisions. So some of those things are happening and making a difference. Other things, and Ryan particularly mentions judicial reviews, other things will take time. So what the government are looking to do for the planning and infrastructure bill is reduce the amount of times that people can try for a judicial review. So, you know, without getting into detail, because I don't understand it completely, you know, at the moment, if a judicial review is seen as totally without merit by a High Court judge, then there are still opportunities for that that request to go on to the next stages, whereas what the government are looking to do is where a High Court or Court of Appeal, finds a judicial review totally without merit at the first hearing in the High Court, then that will be the end of that judicial review. So they're looking to like reduce the opportunities for a judicial review, but that hasn't quite happened yet. So we still got to see whether the proof of the pudding will make a difference. And they're also looking to remove the option of a written process for judicial review. I'm just checking my notes now. So basically things are going to be kind of determined at High Court hearing. So basically it's just reducing the amount of times that people who oppose this type of development can try to go through the courts. And the last meeting I had with MHCLG, they were pretty confident that they're going to meet this target for deciding 150 NSIPs. So I was told that I think this was last month, and the current government who started last year have already decided 27 NSIPs. So they're on track now. They're trying to set a target of deciding something like 2 or 3 NSIPs every month for the rest of the Parliament. So I think it has turned a corner. But the big question is, will we actually see development starting and these NSIPs finishing? As Lou mentioned, the consent is a big step, but you've still got a lot of work to do after consent to discharge requirements and get the thing built and developed. And that's the exciting area.
That's great. Thanks, Gareth. And I think that's really interesting. I guess that raises the question in my mind, just understanding how many are kind of with government. So where is the backlog with them, if they've managed to decide that many in, you know, a relatively short period of time. So really interesting there. And I think the timescales as well that you're talking about have only been up to, as you said, the consent. So we'll have to wait and see. I think this is wait and see seems to be a sort of theme at the moment, doesn't it? Wait to see how many houses are built, wait to see how many large infrastructure projects get consent, because I know the.
But if your work, I don't know if we've got any. Sorry, but I don't know if we've got any people on the call here from places like Lincolnshire or like Essex. You know, they will be feeling that if anybody puts an application in for a solar farm, it kind of, you know, things are moving pretty fast because there is, you know, understandably, there's been a positive response to that. And then, like you said, Lou, you're working on many of those, aren't you? So, you know, you probably get a sense of how quickly it's moving from your perspective too.
We've got another couple of questions sort of policy related, so I'm going to ask those now as well. So we know that we're expecting updates to the National Planning Policy Framework, and Gareth, you've mentioned that government have also introduced measures that will guide the updating of national policy statements that guide NSIPs. Is there any relationship between these, or are they entirely separate?
They are separate. And I might look to Lou for any advice that she's got on this, but they are separate, and the NPS is the reference point. But local plan policy will be considered by the examining authority when they're making their decision. It's just where it lies in the balance of things is much lower, and there are kind of. What the government are trying to do is trying to make sure that the NPF and the NPSs align much more kind of like in a more constructive relationship. So some schemes like, you know, data centres, gigafactories, laboratories, etc., do cross over into reach, but normally there's quite a clear dividing line. Is that a fair answer, do you think, Lucia?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's kind of the mitigation of material considerations from a policy perspective, I suppose, and for NSIPs, the national policy statements are that. So the energy ones there's now 7 energy policy statements. They got published on Monday following consultation earlier this year. Not on Monday, sorry, on Friday. Following consultation earlier this year, there's news around kind of whether data centres and gigafactories are going to come under the NSIP regime. So the national policy statement is the primary and principal planning policy consideration. NPPF does support that, and there are obviously parts in the national policy statements which simply say refer to NPPF on this. So it's still important. You still have to have regard to it. I think historically they haven't particularly aligned, which is probably a running theme throughout planning policy. But I think you're kind of the summary, Gareth, in that they are kind of more speaking towards each other, especially now the NPSs are being updated and brought into the current environment that we're working in, which is drastically different to what we were previously. For example, the water NPS, I think it's only been designated like a year and it's already been updated 3 times.
Wow,
I think
brilliant.
MHLG are now kind of putting their foot down and saying they don't want to update it anymore, which I can kind of understand. But they have promised to update it kind of materially once every 3 years and do 6-month incremental reviews. So hopefully we can start to see similar appetite from the likes of DEFRA and MHLG on other planning policies as well. But so I guess, yeah, that's a very long way of saying yes, some interaction and hopefully more moving forward.
But as a planner, you look at both, I guess, will you, Lou? You know,
Yeah.
but primarily the NPS, but yeah, you will be aware of what the NPPF says, because that can sometimes fill in the detail that's not in an NPS as well.
Yeah, exactly. So again, I think earlier this year, and it's one of the links I've circulated in my slides is on the planning inspector's advice notes, they put kind of a draft structure of an application together and how they expect you to put your various volumes of your development consent order application together. One of those is volume 7, which is kind of other documents, and as part of that, your planning statement sits. So what you would expect to see in a town and country planning application or kind of smaller consents, you would do a planning statement and a planning assessment. What is now being introduced kind of through the NSIP regime is a policy compliance document. So essentially, it's very dry and very boring and often starts as an Excel document, but it's incredibly important. And it sets out all of the relevant policy from the national policy statements, from the NPPF and from local planning authorities as well. So whilst local planning policy isn't necessarily a material consideration and your compliance with it isn't kind of material to the decision making of whether an NSIP gets granted, it is still something that applicants have to evidence that they've had regard to and have considered. So yeah, so for example, if you pick a site that is earmarked as please do not put any solar on this, it needs to be XYZ, and then the solar developer comes on and says I want to put solar on it, that might cause some questions and raise some things, and I'll have to kind of put really strong evidence forward as to why they can go against that. So yeah, it's similar, just on a bigger scale as to what you would expect in smaller planning applications.
That's brilliant, thank you. Really comprehensive answer and really helpful to understand a little bit more about how they interact as well. So we've got another policy question. So alongside all the planning reforms, we've also got local government reorganisation and devolution white paper out. So just a question about whether further devolution might affect NSIP planning and delivery and what the relationship there may be.
Do we know? It's a really good question.
Yeah.
I genuinely don't know. So I think it's, well, I think the devolution agenda is really interesting and a very positive one, because I've worked in combined authorities in Greater Manchester and South Yorkshire. So I'm a big fan of devolution, and I would kind of think it's very positive for planning. I don't think there is a formal link, but there are some really positive things that can come out of it. So if you look at places like Greater Manchester, because they have a combined authority, they've got the devolution powers already. They've already got an infrastructure board, and because they're quite a powerful body, they can invite people like National Grid, United Utilities, who are the water board, and some of the other big infrastructure providers to be part of their board. And they're already talking to these infrastructure providers about the infrastructure needs, not just of the city region of Greater Manchester, but some of the other schemes that are going to take place in Greater Manchester that are of national significance as well. So although there's no formal planning control at the devolution combined authority level, it does provide a platform for local authorities through the combined authority to engage directly with the big stakeholders that kind of are, doing the big infrastructure. And I think that's really positive. We don't think SDSs are going to be necessarily kind of set in national infrastructure, but they will have to know where that national infrastructure is and give some kind of spatial representation of that national infrastructure. So again, it's another opportunity, I think, for the devolution agenda to be positive for the whole NSIP agenda. So I think it's short answer, it's still to be decided, but where we have seen it happening in Greater Manchester, it is a priority for a combined authority. So they will seek to be doing something constructive around infrastructure if they've got anything about them.
That's great, thank you.
Is that a fair answer?
And I'm going to come back now to a question that Isabel asked quite early on in the presentation that you touched on in your response briefly, Lou. So just looking at the economic benefits. So can an NSIP in your local area be beneficial to the local economy? And then is there a way in which, or can NSIPs be used to address regional imbalances? So if you've got any insights to that, Lou, would be really helpful.
Yeah, so I think the first part in can an NSIP be beneficial to the local economy? Yes, I think it depends on what the NSIP is and the scale of it, and also the appetite of the developer. So as I kind of mentioned, as part of applications, more often than not, the applicant will provide a socioeconomic impact assessment. So that will look at things, kind of as I mentioned, from development land allocations to public rights of way to the wider economic impact assessment. So for things like reservoirs, obviously the economic impact of that is massive. They'll have their own standalone assessments. Obviously it's tends to be not just a reservoir, there'll be a whole host of associated development with it. For things like solar and wind, they're kind of smaller scale because during construction there'll be positive economic benefits in terms of job creation. Applicants will have to look at the local skills versus kind of nationally teams brought in. So that's obviously the construction workforce, but there's also things like construction accommodation. So can they use hotels or Airbnbs or kind of private rentals instead of transporting in and out, and or if they're not local. I think in terms of kind of using NSIPs to address regional imbalance, probably not so much, but just because it's not a spatial way of looking at infrastructure historically. Gareth alluded to obviously the ongoing energy reforms, the kind of the NESO process in terms of grid connection, that's causing, I think, all energy developers to lose quite a lot of sleep. And obviously nuclear and aviation infrastructure are spatial led strategies and policies, but for other types of infrastructure it's not. I think so directly I don't think NSIPs can be used to address regional imbalance, but I think indirectly through the use of community benefit funds, kind of your section 106 agreements, absolutely. I suppose the purpose or the kind of the main caveat to that is that community benefit funds and section 106 agreements are not a material planning consideration in the NSIP world. So for example, some energy developers will say they'll put £500 per megawatt generated per year as a kind of community benefit fund as a standard principle. So depending on the scale of your project, that can be, £1 million over its operational life or more so, which sounds a lot, but actually when you divide it by 40 years, it doesn't add to much. But it's not a material planning consideration like the socioeconomic element of it is. So I think there's again a very long-winded way of saying kind of yes and no, but yeah, in some instances I would say. I don't know if Gareth, you've got an opinion from your
background. That's really, I agree, it's yes and no, but some of that, this links to that point around the local authority role, doesn't it? Because this is where local authorities can be really effective and actually bring some ideas and solutions to this. So what would be of benefit to the local economy? So like we're working with Essex County Council and their economic development people work closely with their planners, thinking about the skills and employment needs for some of their, they've got a lot of things like data centers and energy generation schemes in their areas. What kind of technical engineering kind of skills and professions can that bring to the area, and how do they maximize it? I know a lot of these schemes aren't very job dense, we call it, don't we? You know, kind of, they don't necessarily employ a lot of people for the space that they take up. But when you look at the scale of some of these schemes, it can be really important. Similarly, you know, if you look in Lincolnshire, the proposal there is for a new reservoir in Lincolnshire, and the local authority there are talking to Anglian Water about the economic development opportunities for tourism. So not just, you know, having a nice picnic site next to the reservoir, but actually some funding to help local businesses set up bed and breakfast, hotels, hospitality skills and things like that. So I would say this is where the local authority can really make greatest impact, because they know what that means in practice, and it's not really the applicant's job necessarily to know this. They could really, you know, benefit from the advice from the local authorities.
That's brilliant. Really interesting answer. Lots of examples there as well. So just a couple of questions that people put onto Slido. So when you're showing the graph of the map of the geography of NSIPs, Gareth, you mentioned that a number of them are offshore, particularly offshore wind farms to the east of England. So a question here is just related to that. Are local authorities still involved in offshore NSIPs? So how does that work with their jurisdictions? And then how does public consultation work in those arenas as well?
Well, yeah, the local authority interest is where it lands on shore, isn't it? It's where it comes ashore. I think that's where local authorities will have an interest, because obviously that eastern coastline, Essex, Suffolk, Norfolk, as we've heard, is where a lot of those offshore wind farms need to kind of like be connected to the grid, I guess, really. So it is looking at the area, the location that happens, and then, you know, the kind of infrastructure that's required where it lands on shore, but also then the transmission network to be able to connect that into the grid itself. So yeah, the application, you know, the consultation is really important there. As Lou said, pre-application can be really important, because I've spoken to colleagues in Essex that managed to get one, you know, the location of one scheme moved by a couple of kilometres, that really made, well, their lives a lot easier, because it avoided disruption with, you know, road networks or with other developments in the county that the county wanted to prioritise. So, you know, some of that very early stage consultation can make a big difference, because you've got some big questions to answer there. But going right through the process to delivery as well, actually constructing and kind of building these developments, the local authority will stay involved, because that's when, you know, the noise, the mess, the mud, the kind of, you know, discharge of all those things need to be managed as well. So it's throughout the whole process. But I bet Luke's got some better examples of that, because I think each one is a story in its own right, isn't it, really, I imagine, for these?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, I probably have, but not off the top of my head. I think what you said covered it all. But yeah, I think the where it becomes on the landfall is the most important point. There's often a lot of onshore works associated with offshore development.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. And then we've got two final questions. So we discussed, well, we know that the Planning and Infrastructure Bill is going through Parliament at the moment, and it's removing the statutory duty to consult the public. So what will the role of the local authorities then be in the NSIP process if that statutory duty is removed?
Well, I'll have a view. I'd be interested to hear the private sector view on this as well, but I think that the rules stay exactly the same for me, because, you know, local authorities have still got a lot of work and value they can bring to an NSIP scheme, you know, helping to, represent and give a voice to the community, but also helping the developer to look at the kind of local impacts and kind of practical mitigation that's required to make their scheme successful. We talked about community benefits and economic development. So the roles stay the same. The question is, will all applicants be as kind of open and as engaged at the pre-application stage without a statutory duty to engage? The government's line is that they will bring out guidance for developers, applicants and other stakeholders to follow, to make sure that that pre-application consultation continues. Some local authorities are worried that without a statutory duty to consult, applicants could not really give enough weight to that guidance and could ignore that guidance. So I think for me, the roles should stay the same, but it's whether we have that early engagement with the applicant to be able to maximise the role of local authorities. That would be my view, but it's interesting to hear how it's been perceived from the private sector, from the applicant side, Lou.
Yeah, I think, oh God, I've probably got about 5 different opinions on it, and they probably all conflict. I think that the role, the parallels between local authorities and their role in the NSIP process and statutory kind of consultation historically are quite removed from one another. So whilst there are correlations between the two, and whilst local planning authorities can and have historically helped with publicising statutory consultations and that kind of member engagement, actually the key focus for the role of local planning authorities in the pre-application stage sits outside of that. There are obviously caveats to that in terms of without the kind of statutory need, the funding for Section 42 consultation responses, which is the kind of the duty to consult, and the local authorities' response to that goes away. There is kind of government funding for local planning authorities to help cover the costs of their roles on NSIPs. So without the statutory duty, the funding for that goes away. So that creates kind of a separate issue. I also think that, and again, maybe this is my background in comms, but any kind of developer worth their soul will still do pre-application engagement and consultation, because the requirement to have regard to consultation feedback and to appropriately consult, whilst the statutory duty is not there, the requirement to evidence that still is. So I think when you read the kind of the legislation in detail, and hopefully the guidance that comes out at the same time that it's enacted, which is anticipated to be this year, despite it going through the courts 100 times, because they can't agree on anything, I think what it will actually say is that whilst there is no statutory duty, there will be hopefully quite detailed guidance on what is still expected of applicants to carry out during that pre-application consultation exercise. So whilst it might not be consultation as we know it in terms of statutory notices, I think there still will be non-technical information. I still think there will be some form of engagement event, whether that's now primarily online rather than in person. I think it depends on the demographic. Again, I think it is down to each developer. But I think actually the role of the local authorities doesn't particularly change. I think what you might see in the first few applications, once that requirement's been removed, is members of the public getting in touch with local authorities to provide their feedback rather than the developer, because they think that perhaps the developer isn't going to do any consultation. So I think there might be a bit of kind of, you guys will feel more like you're getting more public engagement via you rather than via the applicant. But what I'm hoping is that in practice, once it's enacted and once things have settled down and the guidance has come out and it's quite clear on what the expectations are, then actually day-to-day things probably won't change from a local authority perspective during that process.
It's interesting.
Can
I mention? Sorry, can I mention? I think it's really interesting. Sorry, I know we're running out of time, Kat, but I think that's really a good balanced view actually, because it is when this change is made, it is a worry, and as we both said, the local authority role shouldn't change, but it's how it's perceived as well might mean more or less work for local authorities. And I think that's a good point, that local authorities play a really important role, and it's not always easily measured or acknowledged, but in kind of helping local communities make sense of some of these things sometimes, because local people do turn to their local council for these things because they assume they're the ones in charge when they're not, because it's an NSIP. So I think that communication role is even more important. You're right, Lou. But also, I think one of the things we haven't mentioned is a lot of these NSIPs are so big, local authorities need to work together. So some of them are linear, so they cross lots of boundaries. Some of them, like a nuclear power station, are going to have an impact well beyond one individual district. And I think it will be really more important for local authorities to think beyond their individual boundaries and work together at that pre-application as stage as well, in terms of being able to kind of assess and understand the implications and the opportunities of what NSIP is coming their way, so that those kind of relationships are built up earlier on.
That's great. Thank you very much. Lots to think about, I think, in that space, and lots to be worked out. So final question. If you were in charge of the NSIP policy, what would you recommend that could be done to improve it? Gary?
Who wants to go first? Oh, right. Okay.
So the fuller question is, what do you think are some of the limitations, issues, and then what
Can
recommendations
I
you make
be
to improve it?
very local governmenty about this? And something we haven't talked about yet is cost recovery for local authorities. So, and maybe I should have mentioned this, but on a local planning application, the developer pays a fee to the council to pay for the planners and the planning work, and it doesn't always cover the cost, but they pay a fee. Under NSIPs, the applicant, the project promoter, doesn't pay a fee to the local authority. What normally happens is that a local authority negotiate an agreement to recover the costs of time it takes for them to work on it, and that's for a planning performance agreement in most cases. At the moment, that's all done in a negotiated way, and it's not mandatory on an applicant to pay the fees or to pay the costs of a local authority. What I think would improve it most is that it becomes mandatory for developers to pay local authority costs for working on NSIPs. And I can say that because the government have committed to doing it. So they are intending to do it. It just hasn't happened yet. But I think once we have that, it'll enable more authorities to get set up and organised to be able to work on NSIPs in a far more business-like way, get ahead of the curve, develop their own policies and procedures so they can be far more efficient.
Brilliant. Really interesting, and that would obviously help to tackle some of the resource constraints we know are facing local authorities.
Exactly, yes.
As well. Lou, do you have a quick recommendation? I'm running out of time here, but
yeah, no, quickly. I think I guess my limitation with it is that it's just very complex. I think there's so much legislation and guidance and regulations, all of which you have to have regard to, and there will be statutory requirements to deliver elements of each of them. And I think that there's not a particularly helpful one-stop shop of going, okay, I'm doing a DCO, this is what I need to do. Or I'm a local authority kind of working with applicants who's putting in a DCO, this is what I need to do. So I think the limitations is just that it is very complicated. So a recommendation would be to try and streamline it a little bit more. I also think another recommendation would be to not try and reinvent the wheel. I think it's probably a developer issue rather than a local planning authority issue. But something that you will come across is that you can probably get 3 applications of the same type of infrastructure, and they will take wholly different approaches for no logical reason other than to be different, or to try and do things in their view kind of more strategically or easier or more proportionately. So I think there's plenty of opportunity to try and not only streamline the legislation itself, but also the way in which developers take forward applications. And actually, if me acting as a developer can continually be nagged by a local planning authority to do that, I think maybe the message will get across. So that's probably my plea to you all, is start nagging developers for consistency, because it helps me too.
And some of the best authorities have, they have a policy, they publish a policy that they want developers to follow in a consistent way, like an Essex, like a Suffolk. And I think that's exactly down those lines. You're dead right.
That's great, thank you. And really interesting to get different perspectives on that. And it sounds like there's lots of work that we could be done in this space, and work that government are currently doing in this space. So definitely an area of policy to keep on our eyes on. I've just put up the slider code again. If you could please, those of you still on the call, just take a couple of minutes just to fill in a short feedback form. The feedback forms are really, really useful for us to understand how today went, and also for future planning. So as you know, the CPD events have formed part of a programme. So these will be monthly seminars and quarterly away days. It was great to see at the last session, somebody asked for a seminar to understand the kind of more multidisciplinary nature of planning. And you'll be pleased to know that next month we have a session called What Do Planners Do on the 17th of December, where I'll be bringing in an ecologist, a highways engineer, a statutory consultee, so representative from the Environment Agency, and an archaeologist to explain how their different specialisms relate to the work of planners. And also somebody else asked for information on the historic environment, and in February we have Historic England coming in to talk to you about that. So I guess my plea is fill in the feedback form, and it really helps me to shape the programme moving forward and make sure that what we're talking to you about is the topics of interest and helping to fill in those knowledge gaps. Lorraine, you've got your hand up and I can't hear you.
That might be better. Sorry. Kind of related because we touched on CPD, just about the e-learning course. I've had a few completers, which is fantastic. There are a number of grads that haven't completed the e-learning course. There are 5 topics, and we really strongly encourage you to complete that. It is optional, but I think it would really serve you well. Just listening to everything, the acronyms and everything. I'm definitely I'm doing the course myself, so I don't have any ambitions to be a planner, but I'd like to know what I'm doing whilst I'm supporting Kat. So if you could sort of complete that, that would be great. And also just to quickly touch on feedback as well. So any sort of you've completed it. I did send out a short email about completing our feedback form. It would really help us to structure the e-learning and yeah, for our next cohort 4. So if you could do that, that would be fantastic. Again, if you have any questions, send them across to me directly, or the usual Pathways to Planning email address. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks, Lorraine. And good, well remembered though, we were discussing this yesterday. So the e-learning course is for those of you in cohort 3. It's called Introduction to Planning as a Career. And yeah, highly recommend that you engage in that because it will really help you. On a 1:30, I'm guessing everybody's hungry or have got meetings to go to. So just thank you so much to our panel, so Gareth and Lou for talking to us today, and thank you everybody for attending. It's been great to see so many of you. And yes, can we have a cheesy round of applause for our speakers, please? Either real hands or virtual hands, I don't mind, but if we can just say thank you. Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, and yeah, enjoy your lunch, and I look forward to seeing you all in the future. And I'll put the recording on YouTube and send you the slides with all those links. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Nice to see people.
Great. Wow.
Well done. Well done.
That was, oh, hold on.
Oh. Are we stopping recording?